Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Steven Yissil, and tonight we are continuing our deep dive series looking into the Bermuda Triangle, part 36. We are picking up from where we left off last time with chapter 8. We are aiming to finish that chapter today. We're covering UFOs and USOs in regards to the Bermuda Triangle. So, before we get started here, I would like you to leave a like below. And if you have any input, please share it in the comments. So, with that being said, we have two diagrams, sketches that we'll be getting to in this part of the chapter anyway. But that's that. Let's get our Illuminati up here. So those of you that are new to the channel, the Illuminati scraped the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and found quite a bit of evidence of a past civilization, with a brick road being on the ocean bottom. So the Illuminati will carry along with us tonight, and when we get to the sketches that are in the book, I will display them up here for all of you to enjoy. Again, thank you to all of my subscribers, and I truly appreciate you all spending your time to be here. So let's get started, shall we? Page 208, Chapter 8, titled Worlds Above, Worlds Beneath. A disturbing answer to the logistic question, however, suggests itself in the October 18th, 1973 encounter had by the entire crew of an Air Force Helicopter 1 over Ohio. While in flight near Mansfield at 10:03 p.m., Sergeant Bob Yanacsek, spelled Y-A-N-A-C-S-E-K, was the first of the four crew to notice a reddish light bearing down on them from the right. After 30 seconds, he notified the others it was converging on them. Speed seemed to be about 600 miles per hour, and it was on a collision course. Captain Larry Coyne, that's spelled C-O-Y-N-E, took the yoke. The helicopter was currently cruising at 2,500 feet. He set the controls for dive. No sooner had he done this when the light became apparent as a flattened cylinder or ovoid with a dome on top, its silvery nose glowing with red light. It stopped right over the helicopter and hovered. Suddenly, a green light came flooding into the chopper. It lasted from only 12 to 15 seconds, and then the craft quickly moved on. Afterward, Coyne gathered his wits and noticed that the stick should have taken them down rapidly from their 2,500 feet altitude. Yet he now noticed that they had actually gained close to 1,800 feet altitude before leveling off close to 4,000 feet. Circumstances collated by the 4 witnesses aboard basically credit the UFO as following the pattern of any stalking animal, watching quietly, then zooming in on its prey, seizing it, in this case elevating it with it as it quickly rose, but then for some unknown reason abandoning it almost immediately and taking off on its way. Larry Coyne's description of it as silvery, big, and oblong with the greenish light is startlingly similar to those features stated by Fred Valentich, spelled Valentich, in 1978, before he too vanished. Unfortunately, though Jose his last name is spelled Jimenez. I'm not going to bother pronouncing it. Clarified for us that the weird object which his son and his son's friend, Jose Torres, had seen was in actuality a glowing light. He did not clarify what color this light was. Whatever the source of his additional information was, this crucial point had not been passed on. In disturbing deference to the theories on UFO sizes and shapes, some have felt that Valentich could have been describing the large, quote, mothership, end quote, type UFO in which apparently the kidnapped Earthcraft are taken, in parentheses according to theorists, end parentheses. But Captain Coyne and his crew, Arijo Jesse, last name spelled Jezzi, Robert Yanasik, and John Healy, described one of the smaller saucers which, in order to abduct a ship or airplane, would have to raise the craft up rapidly to the mothership hovering high above, which it seemed more than capable of doing considering the elevation the helicopter experienced in only a few seconds. Another interpretation as to why the UFO abandoned its initial capture of Coyne's helicopter could be that it was over land, and if we are to attribute the most sophisticated intelligence to the supposed UFO occupants, then the disappearance of a craft over land would be something they would avoid, as such an event would have no explanation whatsoever in our frame of reference unless it was over jungle, in which cases we would naturally assume we simply couldn't find the wreckage of an ordinary accident, precisely what we tend to do with disappearances over oceans. It is interesting to note that in both the Valentich and Torres Santos cases, the, quote, weird objects, end quote, assailed them at dusk when human eyesight and depth perception is at its poorest. A very disturbing coincidence if we are to accept a sinister motive behind the disappearances. We must bear in mind Gordon Creighton's admonition when theorizing on these cases. that these things do not exist and are not capable of doing the things of which we theorize, something that becomes increasingly hard to do as more incidents accrue. Along with UFO interest over military bases, which has proven itself to be periodic, with the heaviest concentration taking place in the first, quote, flap, end quote, in the late 1940s, UFO sightings have been more numerous and consistent over the oceans and especially in the areas of the Bermuda Triangle. The very disquieting pattern which inspired the theory that many of the disappearances, especially those of the most inexplicable kind, are actually the result of UFO destruction of the aircraft or intentional kidnapping of the inhabitants therein. Apparently now, with Coin's case set forward, this is done by the smaller disk pulling the aircraft up higher in altitude to what is called the mothership, where it can then be deposited inside. There is a particularly confusing disappearance in the triangle in which a UFO exists only by inference. One of the most qualified pilots to ever vanish was Richard Yerex, last name spelled Yerex, with over 16,000 flight hours. I just want to do the math of that real quick. $16,000 flight hours divided by 24 is 666 days. 0.6 repeating. Or 1.82 years of flight. He had retired from Ford Motor Company and was now, at 56 years old, part-time shuttling people back and forth to the Bahamas in a beefy Cessna Twin 402. At 9:15 a.m., May 27th, 1987, he had taken off from the Palm Beach International for a 50-minute flight to Marsh Harbor, Great Abaco. Radar tracked him up to 12 miles east of the airport. However, another pilot claimed that she heard him reporting what he thought was a large balloon, and this was taken to mean the U.S. aerostatic balloon at High Rock, Grand Bahama Island, though this is far from only 12 miles east of the Florida coast. The National Transportation Safety Board would only concede that an aircraft resembling Yerex's Cessna has been seen passing over Marsh Harbor around ETA and continuing into the open Atlantic, never to return. This observed behavior is enough to suggest that either Yerex was dead inside or not even in the aircraft any longer. Perhaps the NTSB's reluctance to accept the other pilot's claim is that there was no reason for Yerex to be reporting anything routine to another pilot, and the alternative to a large balloon is a UFO. Sightings of UFOs in the Bermuda Triangle have described a similar progression to their behavior as the saucer reported by Captain Coin, except with a noteworthy exception: no levitation, indicating that in Coin's case, at least it was intentional and possibly an aborted abduction, a mistake never made in the triangle. Shipmaster John Carpenter, in his day a tough, red-headed, no-nonsense skipper had such an encounter. He is also one of the few to publicly speak about it, a trait only the hardiest of salts seem to possess. As with other encounters, the first indication was an electromagnetic effect. He confessed to Richard Weiner, spelled W-I-N-E-R, a Miami filmmaker, in parentheses, the title The Devil's Triangle from 1974, end parentheses, the following account. We noticed that the compass began to act up. It was oscillating just like you had a strong magnet in the proximity of the compass. We happened to notice about this time a strange greenish light coming in low over the water out of the southeast. And it was coming in at a very slow clip. And it came in and hovered right above the water, and the water that night was very calm because there was no clouds, no storms. The moon was almost full and the visibility was excellent. And this object hovered right above the surface of the sea for a few moments, and then it just turned up on its edge and descended right out of sight into the depths. That's the end of the excerpt. Another encounter was had by diver Bruce Mornier, last name spelled M-O-U-R-N-I-E-R, who can almost be said to have sighted the same object only at a different time and place, after it had entered the ocean. His account also uncannily reflects the shape of the Pascagoula USO, only larger. While in the Bahamas near the Gulf Stream, he saw two USOs, underwater submersible objects, but which nevertheless fit the description given by others of aerial UFOs or flying saucers. Hey Lerny, good to see you in here. Now the following is an excerpt. There's two underwater UFOs, or two things you've never seen before. They've been buzzing alongside the boat, and now they're off the front, kinda heading from south to north. So I looked out. I seen these two things. I guess they're about 60 feet apart. 60. They're buzzing along in formation. They're egg shape. They're round. More or less egg shape / round. I guess about 40 or 50 feet in diameter and the same distance long. A little bit to the egg shaped side. And in brackets it says ovoid. And I follow them, again in brackets, visually, for about, I don't know how long. I just watched and tried to figure out what it was. I couldn't believe my eyes. They looked like they were really moving out faster the further they got away. It looked like they were about 40 feet underwater. Maybe 20 feet, 40 feet. It's out in the crystal clear Gulf Stream. They kept on going off. As they faded away, I don't know if they faded off in the distance or whether they made a dive down or what, but they were gone. And that's the end of that excerpt. So we're hearing a lot about these ovoid, disc-shaped, and egg-shaped crafts that are hovering above the water and then diving into the water with no explanation. Alright, continuing on. Repeated sightings of UFOs both within and without the triangle have often gone hand in hand with a blue-green glow and, most often, in proximity to the sea. And a curious and disturbing parallel, on July 19th, 1965, Australian diplomat Dennis Crowe came upon what he estimated to be a 20-foot diameter flying saucer sitting on the sand at Vaucluse Beach, Australia. And that beach is spelled Vaucluse. He approached it to within 60 feet, his dogs barking all the time, at which time the saucer lifted off the beach with the sound of gently rushing air and zoomed away. So we do have a diagram here, or sketches of these sightings, and now is the time to show them. So give me a moment. So we're talking about the third one here right now. And this is just to give you an idea of what these people witnessed. The caption on these sketches says, or reads, "The most clearly photographed flying saucer has presented itself as two flattened cones. The flatter outer cone revolves around the central cone or dome. There is a hole in the top of the dome. Contrast this on the right with the earliest described, quote, flying saucers, end quote, ovoid or ellipses. Top is Ward, Colorado, 1929. So that's on the far upper right corner. Bottom is Ken Arnold's saucers he saw on June 24th, 1947. Continuing reading on here. Because Crowe was also an illustrator, he was able to draw a distinct shape to the, quote, flying saucer, end quote. This showed two flattened cones, the lower making up the saucer shape, which had a rim that glowed blue-green, but which turned to orange-red when it zoomed away at tremendous speeds, an event which left his dogs eerily silent. An essentially identical flying saucer was photographed near Darmstadt, Germany in August 1953. And that city's spelt Darmstadt. The lower cone or disc, as opposed to the central cone or dome, rotated in a clockwise motion in both instances, setting off the glowing blue-green light or pulses from the rim. Nearly identical saucers were seen to lift off in Russia, two within a minute of each other. The event must have been detected by the nearby Soviet military base because the witnesses then saw searchlights come on and sweep the sky. Yeah, that sounds about right. The event occurred on October 4th, 1955, and the three witnesses were no less than Senator Richard Russell, and in parentheses it says the letter R in Georgia, end parentheses, Lieutenant Colonel E.U. Hathaway, and Reuben Efron, committee consultant to the Senate Armed Forces Committee. They were traveling by train in the Trans-Caucasus region between Atjadi and Adzijabul. So those two places, I'll spell those out. First one, ATJATY, and the second one, ADZHIJABUL. And I'd just like to reiterate here, I am spelling these words out for those of you who want to research this further on your own. The time was 7:10 p.m. when they saw, quote, two round and circular unconventional aircraft resembling flying discs or flying saucers, end quote, taking off, quote, almost, end quote, vertically. Quote, disc aircraft ascended near dusk with outer surface revolving slowly to the right and two lights stationary on top near middle part, end quote. Sparks or flames were seen coming from the craft. The discs ascended fairly slowly until at 6,000 feet, where they then zoomed off northward. Quote, flying attitude of disc remained the same during the ascent as in a cruise, like a discus in flight. From the intelligence report, classified at the time as top secret, but released decades later, one gathers the impression that the three witnesses thought this could have been a secret Russian experiment. With hindsight now, this was obviously not the case, since nothing this dynamic has ever become part of mainstream military material. The concept of a flying saucer as a dome or cone within a rotating disc was pervasive in the early years of ufology. In the hands of Donald Keyhoe, last name spelled Keyhoe, this description helped to explain their motive power as being based on magnetic energy. With the help of Wilbert Smith, who was keenly interested in the phenomenon, he was able to explain the many shifts in color that UFOs displayed. Smith believed they were caused by the disk's rotation. When it is heating up, it is pink. Then as it grew hotter, the coronal light would be red, then red-orange, then yellow, and then white as its fastest speeds, or at its fastest speeds. The bluish-green would be at lower altitudes in certain atmospheric conditions. Smith's interpretation, of course, was based on his theory that the saucers used the Earth's magnetic field for energy, creating a, quote, magnetic sink, end quote, in which they funnel the power into their discs. Hey, Andreas. Good to see you here. Thanks for commenting and letting me know you're here. I appreciate it. He also believed they would have to be unmanned. However, according to NASA scientist and UFO believer Paul Hill, the light seems to come from the saucers because of ionized air around them. He notes that in many of the encounters, the saucers appear to be maneuvered by intelligence inside and not by remote control. Ionized air, more than anything, would best explain the phenomenon of the varied colors of light. One encounter in the triangle seems to combine the blue-green coronal light of UFOs and the effects of, quote, electronic fog, end quote. This was experienced by Chuck Wakely, last name spelled Wakeley, who confided in Dr. J. Manson Valentine about his experience. However, in this case, though it happened at night, the pilot was unaware of any fog or saucer, possibly because the aircraft was intensely glowing blue-green. It was November 1964. He was flying a charter for Sunline Aviation on a near-identical course as Bruce Gernon, from Nassau to Miami. He had just passed the northern tip of Andros and was soon expecting to pick up the Bimini VOR en route. He was at 8,000 feet. At this moment, quote, I began to notice something unusual, a very faint glowing effect on the wings. At first I thought it an illusion created by the cockpit lights shining through the tinted plexiglass windows, because the wings had a translucent appearance, appearing pale blue-green, although they were actually painted bright white. End quote. After the glow became so intense, he had trouble reading the instruments. His, quote, magnetic compass began revolving, slowly but steadily. The fuel gauges, which he had read half full at takeoff, now read full. End quote. Alarmed by his autopilot taking the airplane into a hard right turn, he flew manually, yet totally blind. So that actually sounds like he was being steered into a death spiral. Quote, I could not trust any of my electrically run instruments, as they were either totally out or behaving erratically. End quote. Soon the whole aircraft was glowing. Quote, at this point I could no longer rely on my gyro, horizon, and altitude indicators. End quote. Fortunately, after about 5 minutes, the glow began to fade. After it dissipated, quote, all instruments began to function normally. End quote. Although Wakely believed the glow was being generated by his aircraft for some unknown reason, a consideration of his encounter in connection with other UFO incidents will give rise to Valentine's theories that UFOs may sometimes unintentionally destroy aircraft while inspecting them. Had Larry Coyne and his men not seen the UFO approach, they would only have been dazzled in a green light of unknown origin, which, if it had lasted as long as Wakely's encounter, it could have disrupted all the panel instruments. So again, we're dealing with magnetic anomalies, electronic fog, lights being generated from that, which magno-electricity tends to do that. But it's good that they took manual control over their aircraft to prevent possible death. We don't know what these UFOs are trying to do. It's almost like they're predatory. Right? Alright, let's carry on here. Many of the above accounts reflect the most disturbing pattern uncovered in the reports of UFOs. More than their pattern of visiting or surveilling military and defense development bases, they are seen to come and go from the ocean, as though they dwell in the ocean or enter the Earth's atmosphere over the oceans so as not to be detected by radar. They are associated with disappearances only over the ocean, and they frequent particular locations in the oceans more than others. UFOs almost seem based off the west coast of Puerto Rico. Both large and small UFOs have been seen here, as if to suggest a symbiotic location for the motherships, bearing in mind that motherships and flying saucers do not exist. Long before the Torres/Santos disappearance, and even before the Adjuntas flap of 1972, with the attendant disappearances of boats or their occupants off the west coast, the following report was filed. For 30 minutes on May 14th, 1952, 5 witnesses standing on a bluff near Mayaquez Bay saw 2 spherical orange glowing lights, quote, bright like the sun, end quote, on the dark horizon. Again, it was just at sundown, which had occurred only 4 minutes before. Apparently, the intensity of the light was the reflection off the objects of the setting sun over the horizon. Visibility was 20 miles, making for no obstruction. One of the objects was large and stationary, and the smaller one moved about near it. The objects were so distant that the movement of the smaller light could only be discerned through binoculars. The Air Force intelligence investigator wrote the following, and in parentheses, this is report number IR-24-52, end parentheses. Quote, there was no regular formation, but one object, thought to be the larger of the two, appeared stationary, while the smaller of the two seemed to dart away from the other at a rapid rate of speed, and then to reappear in close proximity to the larger. There was no exhaust, sound, or conventional type of propulsion noted. End quote. So we have another map here. And the subheading here is locations of disappearances, derelicts, and UFOs off Puerto Rico. Let's see, I want to make this a little larger. So all on that west coast there. UFO sighting, missing craft, and derelict. For those that have poor vision, I know there's some of you viewers here that say that this is a blessing that I'm reading this out loud. We're looking at a map of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's like it's a rectangle, but on the west coast at the top is Aguadilla, and that has a location of a derelict, a UFO sighting, and missing craft. And then as we move to the middle of the west coast by Mayaguez, that's spelled Mayaguez, from that midpoint down to the southern coast on the west coast. There's UFO sighting, missing craft, derelict, another UFO sighting, another derelict, another UFO sighting, and another derelict. And then on the south coast, just below Cabo Rojo, that's spelled Caborojo, there is another UFO sighting. And then if we move over to the almost on the east coast, but more to the north. So this is on the northern portion of Puerto Rico. At San Juan, there's another missing craft plotted in this overhead map here. So I'll just leave this up for everyone else to take a look at while I continue reading here. And I see we got a comment here in the chat. Just give me a moment. Andreas says, not to mention if some of them are organic in nature or remote controlled, they have nothing to be afraid of. They know they can outfly us or attack. Yeah, unfortunately that's true, Andreas. These things, as I mentioned earlier, they're predatory in nature. They're just hanging out by these boats. One of the previous chapters we were looking into, some of these sailors were taking oars and beating these discs to make them go away, like they're almost like they're annoying fish, like giant, like if there's like manatees. Nothing against manatees here, but you get the idea. It's like they're floating close toward their boat, but it's a disc. And so they take their oars and they're just trying to hit it to see what it is or make it go away. And then not only does it not go away, it goes down to the bottom to make it look to the sailors like it disappeared. But really it's hanging out over on the bottom by the anchor that they've set up. And when they pull up the anchor to go leave, then this thing turns its lights back on, like it's reacting to the anchor moving. So you have that, and then you have these planes that are losing their electronic navigation. They're having interruptions with it, and the lesser experienced pilots end up in a death spiral where they just keep flying downward and to the right until they crash. And in those cases, we've read that there are debris for some of these, but thankfully we have some of these pilots that survived and were able to get out of that death spiral. And then we have these accounts that are presented to us in this book by Gian J. Quasar. Learning in the comments says, it's like humans are seen by aliens the same way we look at wild animals. Yeah, there's several things occurring here. I've heard about the Admiral Byrd expedition and seeing possibly Hollow Earth. In those instances, there's the tall, white, blonde aliens that are in metallic discs. This sounds very similar to what we are reading here from these different accounts. Where are they going underwater? Probably to a base. It's not far-fetched. And we don't truly understand what the intelligence is behind these crafts, but it really may come down to the fact that us as living beings here are vessels containing our souls. The fact that we have souls is probably fascinating to them if they don't have souls. So there's that whole branch of speculation as well. And I say speculation because we don't have solid, hard evidence of any of this stuff, but it's interesting to look into. It does seem like we're being studied like we're wild animals, like it's a nature expedition, right? And then what are they doing with that information? It could be as simple as trying to find a way back into heaven, for all we know. It could be connected all the way back to the Nephilim. Alright, so let's continue reading on here. I enjoy the conversation in the chat. I truly appreciate it. By far the most contact with UFOs, or interchangeably USOs, has been claimed by members of the Russian Navy, which in a series of articles beginning with Russia Today, and parentheses published July 21st, 2009, end parentheses, specific mention is repeatedly made of encounters in the Bermuda Triangle. Concerning his own encounters as a sub-commander, retired Rear Admiral Yuri Beketov, the last name is spelled Beketov, has stated that instruments frequently malfunctioned for no apparent reason, adding that since it always went hand in hand with sonar tracking unexplained objects, it could have been deliberate disruption by UFO, quote, creatures, end quote. Speed of such sonar returns was sometimes clocked as incredibly surpassing any known undersea vehicle built by man, reinforcing Beketov's belief their sonar was picking up alien USOs. Frequent contact with USOs was normal. Russian Navy intelligence veteran Captain First Rank Igor Barclay noted, quote, ocean UFOs often show up wherever our or NATO's fleets concentrate, near Bahamas, Bermuda, Puerto Rico. They are most often seen in the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean, in the southern part of the Bermuda Triangle, and also in the Caribbean Sea, end quote. Unquestionably, Admiral Vladimir Azaza, that's last name spelled Azhaza, is one of the most famous Russian ufologists, inspired to become one by his own encounters in the 1960s while commander of the sub Severyanka, and that's spelled Severyanka. And I'm going to take note of this. In an article for the Svobodnaya Pressa, he rendered an apt summation to a lifetime of collating data. Quote, 50% of UFO encounters are connected with oceans, 15 more with lakes. So UFOs tend to stick to the water, end quote. Admiral Vladimir N. Chernavin, that's spelled Chernavin, former chief commander of the Soviet Navy and deputy minister of defense of the USSR from 1985 to 1992, dryly corroborated Azaza, specifying that most ocean sightings, 44%, were actually in the Atlantic, with 16% in the Pacific and 10% in the Mediterranean. So that's pretty interesting to know. Because that leaves a percentage that is not accounted for here. So let me just get to that. So between the Atlantic and Pacific, that's 60%. And then adding the Mediterranean, that's an additional 10, which brings us to 70%. So there's an additional 30% of sightings that are outside of this scope. And that is Chernavin, Admiral Chernavin. Echoing such theorists as Anglo-American naturalist Ivan Sanderson, Admiral Azaza speculated on the idea of underwater bases and boldly replied with a, quote, "Why not?" end quote, attitude. Quote, "Nothing should be discarded. Skepticism is the easiest way. Believe nothing, do nothing. People rarely visit great depths, so it's very important to analyze what they encounter there," end quote. I agree with that. It's very easy to write this whole topic off as nonsense, right? But when you have these individual accounts and they start piling up like this and get compiled into a book such as what we're reading here today, it kind of brushes the naysayers off to, either look into this further to confirm their own bias or start changing their tune and saying that maybe this isn't just speculation. Azaza has not been put off by the current official Russian Navy dismissals of UFOs, knowing that the officers still hold their official duties and their demeanor must reflect caution. The only officers speaking out are retired from Soviet days and have little worry about their futures being affected by a long dead and discredited regime. The question remains, however, how many of these reports are from first-hand knowledge in the Triangle by the Russians, who, except for well-monitored visits to Cuba, were not welcomed in a Caribbean where the U.S. Navy was essentially the only dominant naval force. It is not always easy to determine the reliability of Russian information, as Russians often tend to speak with dogma as if what they relate is a given, and that the challenger must be quite uninformed to even request verifying information. According to Russia Today, only former Rear Admiral and nuclear submarine commander Yuri Beketov was a direct eyewitness when, quote, describing events that occurred in the Bermuda Triangle, end quote. Of underwater UFOs, he declared, quote, "We repeatedly observed that the instruments detected the movements of material objects at unimaginable speed, around 230 knots, and in parentheses, 400 kilometers per hour, and in brackets, 250 miles per hour. That's end brackets and parentheses. It's hard to reach that speed on the surface. The beings that created those material objects significantly exceed us in development." End quote. One reason for such frank admittance of UFO encounters by ranking Russian military is the different attitude the Russians have toward many topics as opposed to their more cautious American counterparts. However, Captain Prikhodko observed it may be more innocent, and the captain's last name is spelled Prikhodko. We simply may be unaware of how much activity goes on undersea, or we misinterpret it. Quote, "The problem is humankind is rushing upwards with great interest and not too intense downwards. Maybe this is a big mistake." End quote. And just give me a moment here. And you know, this does bring up a good question of how were the Soviets allowed into U.S. airspace and able to witness this without being undetected. All right, continuing on. During Perestroika, and that's a political movement for reformation in the Soviet Union in the 80s, Dr. Marina Popovich, spelled Popovich, one of the most celebrated Russian test pilots, sometimes called the Chuck Yeager of the Soviet Union, last name Yeager spelled Yeager, and wife of the cosmonaut Pavel Popovich, who later became head of the Committee on UFOs, became outspoken about Russian Air Force encounters with UFOs. This culminated in a press conference in San Francisco in 1990, in which she showed some of the photographs Russians interpret as proof of flying saucers, including the big cigar-shaped, quote, motherships, end quote, in space. She said that the photo had been taken by a Russian space probe, which soon after mysteriously stopped working and then vanished. Popovich asserted that the Russian authorities concluded that UFOs have been around as long as the planet, a point of view shared by many Western UFO researchers. However, she also declared that she had seen hybrid children, a remark which delights the U.S. intelligence community because it convinces them the Russians are engaged in some psyop or just plain crazy. We're aware of these accounts of hybrids, so it's not really far-fetched today. UFOs, if we are to limit ourselves to the acronym's literal meaning of unidentified flying object, have been seen in the skies of the Earth for a considerable time, even millennia, and variously described as spindles, triangles, kites, and always as luminous blobs or orbs. However, the clearest descriptions have always been of a shiny saucer. Both the armies of Alexander the Great and Roman annalists described seeing a glowing or flaming shield pass through the sky, such as Julius Obsequens in 216 BC, and Julius Obsequens' last name is spelled Obsequens, who records that, quote, at Arpinium, a thing like a round shield was seen in the sky, end quote. It is remarkable that, considering 2,000 years has passed, that flying saucers have not changed in design by any appreciable amount. Lerny says, hybrid children does remind me of the Nephilim. Well, yeah, it plays right into that. That is a clear example of hybrids. But I also want to point out here that while they're stating here that it's remained unchanged, there's also been sightings in the 1800s of what people thought were airships or hot air balloons. I know there's one account from where I live here in Niles in the early 1900s of what they thought looked like an object in the sky that was glowing, that was in the shape of a teardrop, meaning like the point at the top and a rounded bottom. And I'll have to look up that at some point and read it here, or maybe on, if I decide to branch this off and do a UFO deep dive series, which I might do because I do have a few books on UFOs, then I'll bring that up during then. But there's different descriptions of UFOs throughout history, and though they vary in appearance, it is fascinating that even going back to Alexander the Great and Rome, that they were also seeing what appeared to be discs. They just called them shields because that was the thing that it most related to their knowledge of. If you think about the Roman shields are circular. So it's not that far out of the question. One of the clearest descriptions of a flying saucer before their, quote, official, end quote, discovery in June 1947 comes from traveler and visionary Nicholas Roerich, last name spelled Roerich, while transversing Mongolia in the summer of 1926. He recorded in his diary and later published this account in Altai-Himalaya, a travel diary, in 1929 by Scotes. It is contained on pages 361 to 362 in the first edition. So that's another thing about books. If you don't have the first edition of things, there's content that's taken out. And this publication, I will spell it out here. It is ALTAI-HIMALAYA, a travel diary. And we want to look at 361 to 362. Alright, we're going to read the excerpt from there right now. On August 5th, something remarkable. We were in our camp in the Kukanor district, not far from the Humboldt chain. In the morning, about 9:30, some of our caravanners noticed a remarkably big black eagle flying above us. 7 of us began to watch this unusual bird. At the same moment, another of our caravanners remarked, quote, "There is something far above the bird," end quote. And he shouted in his astonishment. We all saw, in a direction from north to south, something big and shiny reflecting the sun, like a huge oval moving at great speed. Crossing our camp, this thing changed in its direction from south to southwest, and we saw how it disappeared in the intense blue sky. We even had time to take our field glasses and saw quite distinctly an oval form with shiny surface, one side of which was brilliant with the sun. And that's the end of the excerpt. Again, it remains remarkable that the shape and size, including the speed, has not altered. The above account of a mirror of what the ancient Greeks and Romans reported so long before, and what so many modern people reported again after 1947, only now far more frequently. Andreas says here in the chat, I heard of a few alien species, supposedly light beings, and I think of what's the difference between light they have and God's light that he gave us human beings. Is it a different kind of light, in my opinion? It's a very good question. I would say that they again, this is my speculation. They're borrowing God's light. Now, are they using it for nefarious and false purposes? That's still out for debate. Lerny says, Andreas, I believe there is such a thing as false light. And there is. Lerny is correct on that. The false light bringer, Satan. And that goes back to the whole thing of our extraterrestrials demons. Most likely they are. At least that's what I think. Until I get information otherwise, that's what I think is going on. But again, we have to remember, not all of these objects that are being seen are necessarily the demon aliens. Some of these may, in fact, be U.S. government related, being piloted by people. Then there's the concept of the demon aliens. Like, just no aliens are just aliens. Most of them are interdimensional, and that is categorized in my head as demonic. They're trying to break into this reality and mimic or copy souls so that they can re-enter heaven. That's just where I'm at right now with all this. The consistency of these descriptions again underscores how long the phenomenon has occurred and equally how long there remains no contact with Earthlings by those inside the craft, if anybody really is. Instead, they've entered our folklore, today being the province of the occult and the seance crowd, who have forsaken 3,000-year-old Egyptian priestesses or winsome Indian chiefs as their mediums for little gray aliens. The entire UFO enigma only flirted with scientific explanations for the first few years after 1947, when UFOs were thought to have a very understandable origin in secret Soviet experiments or as interstellar craft from Venus or Mars. Many ufologists theorize that more than one different type of people, or if insectoid creatures, visit the Earth, noting that many oddly shaped craft among the more ubiquitous saucers have been consistently reported in the skies over time, indicating more than one engineering science and perhaps culture behind the spaceships. Be that as it may, too many theorists try to include almost every sighting report into their dossier rather than becoming critical and focusing on the quality of the reports and the caliber of the witnesses. Critical analysis repeatedly highlights only the saucer-shaped, quote, UFO, end quote, with rare exception to the cigar-shaped, quote, motherships, end quote. It is so consistent that the former Chief of Defense Staff of Great Britain, the Lord Hill-Norton, said that, quote, U stands for more, or U, let me reread that. Quote, U stands more for unexplained than unidentified, end quote. Because a disc is invariably the shape of a, quote, UFO, end quote. Analysis also reveals that historical sightings of genuine, quote, flying saucers, end quote, were very rare and always distant. However, after 1947, there was an explosive increase in sightings. So many, in fact, that a pattern could easily be discerned. Saucers were based in the Bermuda Triangle and showed a habit of gathering off the U.S. East Coast at the 37th parallel, in parentheses, near Norfolk, Virginia, end parentheses, before dispersing to reconnoitre. The August 4th, 1950 report of a flying version of the Pascagoula USO is a case in point. Its reported reciprocal course in the direction of freighter indicated it was coming from the Norfolk area. The 37th parallel has become so identified with flying saucers it is often dubbed the UFO Highway. A sinister slant was given to this pattern in the 1970s during the Great Cattle Mutilation Scare, when it was discovered that the most inexplicable mutilations were occurring along the parallel in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. And one of those researchers for those mutilations was and still is Linda Moulton Howe. So I've watched a lot of her work and material. She brings up pretty valid claims on all of what happened there. And it does seem like there's an experimental aspect going on to the cattle mutilations. Because there's like no blood. Blood's removed from the cattle. Organs are removed. One case in particular I remember, it was just like the anal cavity was like lasered out, so it was cut out, but there's no blood. There's a lot of different crazy stuff to look into with the cattle mutilation. But it seems like it's mostly geared toward the reproductive organs of the cattle, which makes me tend to believe that whatever is participating in that, it cannot reproduce on its own, which is why it brings us right back to the hybrid conversation. Although the most obvious mutilations have an easy answer in predators, several of the cattle were found drained of blood, part of their lymphatic system removed, and some were found dropped in trees. Photographs are always subject to interpretation, but it is curious to note here that one of the earliest photos of a flying saucer is dated April 1929 over Ward, Colorado. It shows an ellipsoid disc identical to the descriptions of the Pascagoula USO and the one contained in the August 4th, 1950 report in the CIA files. Another coincidence is found in the description of the object by the photographer Edward Pline. He said it was as large as a, quote, very large boulder, end quote, which fits the description of 10 foot by 12 foot ovoid disc. I'm trying to see if I can bring this up here. It appears there's a lot of different photographs here. This one, the sawmill, right? Oh, this one's from 29. Okay, let's look this up. Because it's not in the book here. I assume Gian couldn't get it for the copyright purposes in here. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have been published in this book. Okay, I think I've figured out which one this is. Alright, so let me get a screen share here. Here we are. Let me bring this to the back. Hold on. So this here is that photo by Edward Pline. Sawmill at Ward, Colorado, April 1st, 1929. So this is it. I'll make it a little bigger. And that's that. So bring the Illuminati back up on here. While the ramifications of the cattle mutilation scare are not of direct relevance here, the coming and going of flying saucers from the Bermuda Triangle is, and in addition to the pattern that shows they enter the U.S. over the 37th parallel, the pattern of sightings reveal they return to the triangle via the Gulf of Mexico, indicating that they had largely concentrated their reconnoitering over the West and Midwest. I'm going to take a pause here real quick. By far one of the most astounding encounters, confirming this pattern is also one of the most documented concerning the return of saucers to, quote, motherships, end quote. This vivid radar encounter happened in the dark, early morning hours of December 6th, 1952, when a B-29 crew found themselves between three groups of UFOs. They were about 200 miles south of Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico, when each group, at intervals over a period of 6 minutes, sped past them at 5,000 miles per hour in a direct line to the Bermuda Triangle. The three groups amounted to a veritable fleet of 20 radar returns. Visually, they were blue-white streaking lights. One group zoomed past the B-29 within only a few miles, a potentially fatal proximity at their incredible speed. After a few minutes, the third group reappeared on their radar scopes, this time behind them and approaching them. Although keeping their distance, radar showed that the targets slowed and paced the aircraft for several seconds, as if scouting or considering the B-29. Then a half-inch spot appeared on their radar scope, indicating a UFO truly incomprehensible in size. The smaller blips rushed to the huge blip and merged with it. The large blip then accelerated and left the radar scope at fantastic speed. In a very real sense, this encounter was replaying in reverse an earlier rendezvous, this time visually observed in circumstances that bear on it and the subject at hand. It was the night of July 14th, 1952. At 9:12 p.m., a Pan American DC-4 was over Chesapeake Bay and heading south to Miami when the pilot and co-pilot saw off the left front quarter 6 flying saucers glowing amber red come in from the Atlantic. They were in echelon formation, with the trailing 5 slightly off to the right and incrementally above the lead saucer. The pilot and co-pilot, Bill Nash and Bill Fortenberry, estimated each had the diameter of 100 feet. The first one slowed, causing the next 2 to waffle and almost overtake it. They all slowed, and then the lead saucer banked on its side and headed west, and the others did likewise and followed. Quote, immediately after these 6 lined away, end quote, jointly recalled the pilots. Quote, 2 more objects just like them darted out from behind and under our airplane at the same altitude as the others. The 2 newcomers seemed to be joining the first group on a closing heading, end quote. The 8 flying saucers headed inland and finally vanished. It is the event above, in parentheses, the first recorded along the 37th parallel, end parentheses, that piqued the interest of NASA aeronautics engineer Paul Hill. He was located nearby and had already been interested in the possibility that saucers were real and from another planet. He had noted the pattern they had already displayed, seeming to come from the oceans, and their propensity to appear at dusk/evening. With a friend, he went out to a viewing location near Norfolk at dusk on July 16, 1952, and sighted more saucers. A report was duly made to Project Blue Book, and his encounter was significant enough to be included in Captain Edward J. Ruppelt's 1956 book, Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. And I'm going to take note of that real quick. So this is Captain Edward J. Ruppelt's 1956 book, Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Later, Paul Hill elaborated in his own book, Unconventional Flying Objects, a Scientific Analysis. There's actually 2 of them. In like manner as the flying saucers had appeared to Nash and Fortenberry, they came into the coast from offshore at dusk. They were between 15,000 and 18,000 feet altitude, traveling at 500 miles per hour. He reports, quote, "They slowed into a left turn to pass directly over our heads toward the west. They practically came to a stop as they approached. It was then that they started their strange jitter, a surprising phenomenon. First one leaped a little way ahead of the other, as fast as or faster than the eye could follow. You couldn't be sure. Then the other seemed to jump ahead. They kept up these odd mincing steps for a few seconds as they passed overhead, while we craned our necks." End quote. Now the saucers made what Hill recalled was an, quote, "astounding maneuver," end quote. And, quote, "Maintaining their spacing of about 200 feet, they revolved in a horizontal circle about a common center at a rate of at least once per second. After a few revolutions and without pause, they switched their revolutions into a vertical plane, keeping up the same amazing pace." End quote. Now completely, quote, awestruck, end quote, Hill noticed that another saucer was coming in from the Atlantic. It quickly joined them. Then a fourth came along the James River and joined them. They floated along briefly and then accelerated to the west. During his own personal investigation, he discovered that the third saucer had traveled north offshore. Even aircraft spotters had noted it, in order to join the others. In other words, he discovered that the flying saucers come in from the ocean at dusk. In parentheses, in this case, the Bermuda Triangle, end quote, or end parentheses. And then at night, reconnoiter over land. He deduced that the orbital motion of the two saucers was, quote, a rendezvous signal, end quote. Connecting just a few of these reports from 1952, the year of the, quote, Great Saucer Scare, end quote, underscores not only the oceanic origin of the UFOs, but their base in the Bermuda Triangle. More than one wave came in from the Atlantic, in parentheses at the 37th parallel, end parentheses. And the B-29 later that year encountered 20 returning back out into the Gulf of Mexico, there merging with a huge blip on the B-29's radar scope. The waves coming to the coast did so at dusk. Those returning to the sea did so in the early morning. This pattern is truly disturbing, for it reveals that the UFOs consciously took up a pattern to avoid being detected by prowling over land only at night. This may have been a nightly occurrence, but only on these three occasions, in parentheses, that year, end parentheses, was it witnessed. Over his lifetime, Roy Hill compiled data on observed UFO behavior in flight, always comparing it to the laws of physics, and in doing so discovered that flying saucers did not violate physics. Rather, they conformed to it. It was unquestionable, however, that they used a very novel source of propulsion. One wonders if this unique electromagnetic or gravitational force does not prevent radio communication between the saucers. This would explain the many insect-like manners the saucers display. They don't seem capable of radio contact between each other, but rather they must communicate through gestures. This was also noted by Nash and Fortenberry. When the lead disc slowed, the next two almost overtook it, as if they weren't ready for the change in maneuvering. Regardless of the bizarre and sometimes erratic flying gestures of the saucers, it seemed evident from their pattern that they were controlled by intelligence. Their pattern to survey military installations was so obvious that this inspired Hill to choose his viewing location. There were 5 military installations around this area of Virginia and lots of water. The pattern had also shown that they appear off the coast and return the day after, quote, as though they had not concluded their observations, end quote. And in parentheses, although the actual answer may have been because he was at the 37th parallel, end parentheses. Again, make sure to hit the like button below, and if you have comments, questions, leave them in the comment section here. I can see the live. Also, I do read the comments on these videos after they're published, so just let me know. And just for reference here, the 37th parallel in the United States, it forms the southern borders of Utah, Colorado, and Kansas, and the northern borders of Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And the boundary was established by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, according to my brave browser research here. And it's often referred to as the UFO highway or the paranormal highway. So back to the book here. In developing his studies, Hill learned that on some occasions a UFO was shot at by an observer, in parentheses, usually in the woods or near a lake, in end parentheses, who had a gun handy. The sound indicated they were made of hard metal, in parentheses, even if at the time surrounded by a halo of light, end parentheses. In a case where a supposed landing was examined by French authorities, the weight of the object that had been seen to make the impressions was estimated at 30 tons. Working out the math, he discovered that this indicated the saucer was 96% as dense as water. Quote, very close to the density of a submarine. End quote. Quote, this density, if representative, could explain the observed underwater operation and the apparent multifidus nature of the UFO. End quote, he concluded. He observes, quote, it's particularly important that we take note that an object of this density equipped with a retractable landing gear is a very substantial flying machine made to land on land and having properties consistent with operation from water surfaces or even underwater. End quote. Long before the concept of the triangle's, quote, electronic fog, end quote, Hill noted that, quote, motherships, end quote, were sometimes spotted generating a white cloud around them. And this is one of the more fascinating aspects of all of this, in my opinion. If they were observed operating lower in the atmosphere. Due to the fact that some form of flying saucer had long been reported in the Earth's skies and variously interpreted as portents by the ancients, the flap of the late 1940s has prompted much speculation, even official speculation in the Air Force's early assessment, that visitors from outer space had observed the dropping of the atomic bomb and were now worried about mankind's capabilities, considering our warlike past. The Air Force writer implicitly and perhaps even quaintly leads us to envision Martians or Venusians watching us with telescopes and seeing the horrendous blasts and mushroom clouds. Yeah, I don't know how much credibility is stacked to that one there. However, in light of the fact it took until 1947 for the flap to materialize, one is more tempted to speculate that some mothership constantly on sentinel duty had to return to a distant planet first and marshal enough interest and then en masse the, quote, aliens, end quote, returned in order to assess the situation. They themselves perhaps more perplexed by what mankind had done, since they may never have thought along the lines of the atom. These scouting expeditions would naturally concentrate in the American Southwest, where the bombs were developed and then dropped in the first tests. The quote aliens, end quote, would then need to assess delivery systems, Air Force, and missile bases, but more specifically aircraft and ships. It is during this, the first UFO flap in history, that the most inexplicable disappearances occurred in the Bermuda Triangle. Scouting or reconnoitering would also follow a pattern dictated by logistics. A finite number of craft can only uncover so many military installations from overflights. After locating one airbase, the easiest way logistically is to follow an aircraft to its next destination. This pattern seems strangely evident only in these early years, testified by the frequent reports from airliners and military flights of pacing UFOs. Between sightings of UFOs over 2 military bases, an astonishing disappearance happened over land. Hours before, a large 4-engine DC-4 airliner would take off from Elmendorf Air Force Base at Anchorage, Alaska on January 26, 1950. Base personnel reported a glowing object over the base. This was the second time that UFOs had been seen. On one occasion, 2 were seen hovering over a hangar and emitting a green light. The DC-4 carried 44 military personnel headed to Great Falls, Montana. After a routine report over Snag, Yukon, the large airliner vanished, presumably somewhere over the dense Pacific Northwest. Great Falls would then experience UFO sightings, with the most famous film being taken there in August 1950 by Nick Mariana. The film shows 2 silver discs keeping pace with each other while they overflew the town. Let's see if I can find that. Okay. We do have a short clip of that, so let me get that prepped here. Okay. It's only 11 seconds. So there's that. There is no evidence for the involvement of the 2 UFOs in the disappearance of the military airliner, but the pattern would suggest they discovered one base first and then the other. And I apologize for those that are just listening in here. The footage shows just two dots in the sky flying, and the camera's following it. They're horizontal to each other, spaced apart. The camera pans past a tower and keeps following. It's only 11 seconds, so it's not that long. And it's on film, so there's a lot of dust, and you could see cuts in the film too. But it looked like it was fully put up there. It doesn't look like any information's missing from that. So, here, just to recap that last sentence here. There is no evidence for the involvement of the two UFOs in the disappearance of the military airliner, but the pattern would suggest they discovered one base first and then the other, coming back yet again over a period of months to reconnoiter. While there is no evidence that the UFOs stalked the plane that night, there is evidence that such UFOs would not feel intimidated to, quote, check out, end quote, an airliner that large. Such is the Sanviti case. And Sanviti is spelled Sanviti. An encounter chillingly similar to that experienced by Larry Coyne and his helicopter crew, in which a UFO stalked a large DC-4 over Peru on the night of February 2nd, 1967, and either could not or eventually would not take on the large airliner. It first appeared as a star, but then it grew closer and brighter, so bright that all the passengers saw it, and one even exclaimed, quote, "There's a UFO," end quote. Judging it to be about 8 nautical miles off at this point, the captain, Oswaldo Sanviti, described it as, quote, "really a spectacle," end quote. Due to the controversy created by so many witnesses, Captain Sanviti had to explain on company letterhead. The controversy was not merely over the sighting, but from what the UFO did next. Quote, "After a while, the UFO passed over my plane and stopped right over us. At this moment, we noticed a 15-degree left oscillation on our radio compass, and later a 20-degree right without stopping. All the lights in the main cabin started to reduce the intensity, the same as our fluorescent lights of the cockpit, and all radios out." And next to radios, in parentheses, is reception. "Almost a bit of static noise," end quote. As if the UFO had been feeling the aircraft out, it then moved over the plane to the east. He reports what it did next. Quote, "increasing its light about a 50% into a bluish light, and then disappeared with a fantastic speed," in parentheses, perhaps the speed of light, end parentheses. "After 5 minutes, the UFO returned with another one and situated itself on a close distance with our tail section, and in this formation we flew until 5 minutes before landing at the Lima International Airfield," end quote. Occurring as the UFO hovered closely above, the dead radio becomes a particularly chilling clue. In both the Valentic and Torres/Santos cases, they were able to use the radio right until the end, when apparently the UFO came in very close. Valentic gave us the same clue in his last words. Quote, "Melbourne, that strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft," end quote. Proponents of UFO abductions in the Triangle have always explained the lack of an SOS from a ship or mayday from a plane as being caused by the UFO because, from all examples, the dead radio comes only with close contact. It is beyond the scope of this topic to analyze the UFO phenomenon in detail, but insofar as it is relevant here, it is necessary to note that in that momentous July of 1952, for the first time, a U.S. Air Force pilot shot at a flying saucer. Thereafter, the pattern changed. No more large daytime flights were observed. By day, they confined themselves to the oceans, or presumably their, quote, motherships, end quote. Flying saucers appeared concentrated in the triangle more than elsewhere. They grouped at the coasts at dusk and headed inland. In a cautious but definite agenda to debunk flying saucers, in 1966, Walter Cronkite hosted a special show, UFO Friend, Foe, or Fantasy, on CBS. At one point in the segment, we are assured that the Air Force, through NORAD, has perfect radar surveillance over the USA, and nothing can remain unidentified for long. Although this radar surveillance system's omniscience and omnipresence was itself later debunked in the 1970s, it is humorous in retrospect to recall that during the show, when NORAD's plotting board is shown, the two unknowns plotted thereon were both in the Bermuda Triangle, one over the Bahamas and the other moving toward Florida over the Gulf. There was a reason for CBS to take flying saucers so seriously in 1966. This was the first year of the second great, quote, flap, end quote, which was the most intense in 1966 and 1967. During this period, there occurred some of the most unusual encounters since 1952, namely the Sanviti case and the disappearance of the Witchcraft after striking an underwater object. So, the Witchcraft was a ship. The difference is that the flap did not entirely fade away as it had after 1953. Cattle mutilations began in 1967 and reached epidemic proportions in the mid-1970s. There would be the first recorded disappearance in relation to a UFO, in parentheses, Valentic, in 1978, end parentheses. And then 2 years later, the Torres/Santos disappearance after encountering the, quote, weird object, end quote. David Pears, physics professor at the University of Nebraska, is open-minded to the idea of UFOs. He is convinced some are real spaceships, and therefore they must be coming here somehow independent of our known understanding of time and space travel. He is sure because of his own experience as a 16-year-old young man when, during this second great flap, he too witnessed a UFO and its behavior. He had such a clear view that he could describe. He seemed to invent different spaceships and blonde Venusians each time they meet one, complete and replete with all sorts of vivid gadgetry. The, quote, flying saucer, end quote, Perry's saw was just that. It was a plain lentil, just as the most credible observers have reported, such as Gordon Cooper, and many others. It was a clear August morning, 1969, he recalls, at Goodyear Lake, New York, where he and 5 of his friends were waiting for swim class. And here's the excerpt. Everyone was laughing and having a good time, when all of a sudden, after turning away from the group laughing, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye over the mountain. I was stupefied. A silver metallic disc was just clearing over the top of the mountain on my front left 2 o'clock high. I pointed and shouted out to the group, quote, look, holy shit, it's a flying saucer, end quote. The vehicle was platinum in color, in parentheses, a luster that only platinum presents, end parentheses. No windows, greenhouse, or hatch, or no hatch or panel outlines, protrusions, engines, smoke, or noises, with one exception. A light air buffing sound could be heard as the craft moved through the air. A similar sound when air buffs against the canopy when flying in a glider. The disc was about 60 feet in diameter with about a 10 to 12 foot girth in the middle of the craft. And that's the end of the excerpt. Pears and his swim mates soon checked a topographic map, discovering that the mountain was 400 feet high, giving the saucer an elevation of 500 feet when first seen. It was moving, he estimated, at only 20 miles per hour, which no aircraft could do without stalling. It banked 15 degrees, revealing its entire topside, showing it was a, quote, symmetrical convex lens-shaped object, end quote, with, quote, very distinctive edges, end quote. To this day, Perez admits that his hair still, quote, bristles when I mentally replay the encounter, end quote. The view was so clear that it hit home that he was seeing a craft that no human had made. And here's another excerpt from his experience. The craft never lost an inch of altitude when banking. What was even more intriguing was that when it banked, the sun illuminated very subtle striation patterns in the metal surface, which ran from the front of the leading edge over the center girth over the center girth to the back of the craft. This observation made it clear that the craft did not rotate and that it appeared to have a front, back, and top, even though it had a symmetrical disc shape. And that's the end of the excerpt. So what he's saying is that it banked, it moved, but it did not change altitude. So banking is just going on like a parallel. And then what it sounds like is it has a ring of light that's just kind of pulsing on the surface of it. It says the sun illuminated very subtle striation patterns in the metal surface. Or striation. It's just like lines. After the craft came back level, it accelerated rapidly across the lake and valley and then disappeared 10 miles away over the next mountain range. Perez expressed the usual frustration that no adult came out until too late. One of their moms made it out in time, but she could not get a visual on it as they pointed to the horizon just before it faded over. The encounter was to have a profound effect on him. He admitted it changed his life forever. The details he saw continued to haunt him. He dropped all of his extracurricula in his senior year in high school and took a new track. Quote, "I keep thinking of the encounter and the possibilities of flight over unity, but also realized that there was a greater probability we are not alone." End quote. Being convinced that flying saucers are here despite the prohibitive arguments of space travel, Perez has been broad-minded about considering alternative modes of spaceflight. He has probed into the theories of bending or warping time and space. This led him to consider and accept Bruce Gernon's encounter in the Triangle, and to believe it may be the key to far more than the enigma of lost ships and planes. Rather, perhaps it is the key to how we can master time and space and travel between galaxies in a relatively short time, the method by which possibly the inhabitants of the flying saucers are frequently coming to Earth. To frequent, the believers note, for those to be remote, unmanned probes, or the result of side trips between more regular destinations. While Miguel Alcubierre's warp drive is considered proved, there are still many reasons to consider alternate modes of deep space travel. And Miguel's last name is spelled Alcubierre. And that's something to also look into. Principally, there is the problem of a spaceship fitting within the center of Alcubierre's drive. Detractors believe the energy needed to activate the warp drive would decimate any spaceship therein. An illustrative mock-up has been commissioned by NASA showing exactly what a huge version of the warp drive would look like, housing a spaceship within it. Not so surprisingly, it looks like a long, segregated cylinder with the spaceship bolted by long arms to the inside of the outer cylinder. It is in this way rather like the tunnel through which Gernon flew and survived. Thus, if there is any connection to a natural magnetic vortex and an artificial creation such as Alcubierre's drive, Gernon's flight would indicate that a craft could survive within such a device if it were, quote, tweaked, end quote, by newer discoveries. In a very real sense, the illustrative mock-up of a spaceship inside a giant cylinder reminds us of the, quote, mothership, end quote, category of UFOs. Long, cylindrical, yet far sleeker than imagined by the artist trying to render Alcubierre's warp drive in action. With our present knowledge of warping space, it seems impossible that flying saucers in shape and design could have the power. But a giant cylinder would be perfect, as essentially the entire outer section of the ship is itself the powerful warp drive. Somehow, quote, mothership, end quote, reports of the last 70 years seem too coincidental with our own newly acquired visions of Alcubierre's warp drive to be just that. It seems more that we may have stumbled upon the science necessary for intergalactic travel. For flying saucers of either 20 to 30 feet diameter or even bigger at 100 feet to be here, they would need to come in a carrier that could travel long distances in space in relatively short time spans, and it seems only the quote motherships, end quote, designed like a giant cylinder, conform to the science required as we now understand it. Reports of giant UFOs, both on radar and visually at night, in parentheses, as a light, end parentheses, have confirmed that at times they appear to launch smaller craft, noted by more blips on the scope or visually by lights issuing forth and traveling along with the original light. The larger saucers could be launching the smaller 20-inch discs, in parentheses, or even the 10 by 12 foot discs, end parentheses. But on occasion, especially high in the atmosphere, one wonders if radar is not picking up the motherships. A notable sighting was on February 22nd, 1950. Two huge blips appeared on the Boca Chica radar at Key West. They were estimated to be about 50 miles up. Visually, they were only two bright lights, and the interceptor sent up could not get near them. They soon streaked out of sight. If sight and theory ring harmoniously true, it still strikes the observer as hard to imagine that insectoids could develop such modes of travel from planet to planet, display human ingenuity, and yet remain so insectoid in behavioral pattern that they never see any reason to contact mankind, especially considering the many years and perhaps centuries over which they have been observed visiting Earth. It could be, of course, that the language between insects and humans cannot be bridged, and the quote aliens, end quote, merely remain pragmatic and go about their business. It may mean, however, that there is more than one type of alien life form visiting this planet, and the insectoids are relative latecomers, and because of language or behavioral patterns, remain aloof. Flying saucers, frequent if not predominant in association with the seas, in particular the Bermuda Triangle and the seas off the eastern coast of Australia, plus their almost exclusive association with remote locations over land until 1947, have suggested to some that there is a colony on Earth from another planet, that the, quote, aliens, end quote, live underwater, or need to live underwater, or that they even are native to the Earth and had developed underwater. The last theory seems too impossible to conceive, but it is a curious coincidence with the modern theories of, quote, aliens, end quote, having an insectoid makeup that even biblically we are told that God created the birds and insects out of the oceans as opposed to the heavy, solid, and relatively sedentary mammals like mankind and the animals which he created out of dry ground. If UFOs are to be considered the prime factor in causing airplanes and ships to disappear by removing the airplanes upwards or by actual invasion, of a small boat to get at the crew. The explanation for the difference in number between the mysterious events off Australia and those in the Bermuda Triangle is that the geography of the triangle with its many Caribbean pleasure ports is more conducive to kidnapping, and in parentheses, or space snapping, end parentheses, as there is simply so much more opportunity. The above suggestion for the numerous disappearances in the triangle has been offered repeatedly, almost to the point it is offhand. Upon consideration, however, it more than aptly fulfills the military maxim that, quote, strategy is easy, but logistics is difficult, end quote. It offers no reason why aliens would need so many examples of aircraft, or if disgorging the plane from its mothership's holding bays and only keeping the human occupants for whatever sanguine or nefarious reason, why bother when it is so much easier to take people from lonely places, shorelines, and from ships without needing to dump the cumbersome and bulky aircraft afterward? It seems obvious that there must be a correlation between motive and frequency, and there doesn't appear to be any when it comes to UFO abduction theories. There is only one case of an aircraft disappearance in the triangle in which the circumstantial evidence supports that a UFO played a factor in it. Admittedly, one is enough to prove the principle. Another disquieting coincidence is that the disappearance was that of a very light aircraft. Given the power of the UFO experienced by Larry Coyne's helicopter, it was more than capable of lifting a small airplane. But the most often asserted theory, namely that aliens are checking humankind's technological progress, doesn't fit. The taking of a puddle jumper air coupe in 1980 was a major step back from the jets and airliners that had vanished earlier in the triangle, and any technologically sophisticated culture would easily see this from afar. This leaves the only and disturbing alternative, namely, it was relatively easy to interdict such a light craft, and the UFO was ultimately only, in parentheses and always, end parentheses, interested in the occupants. Even if this last supposition is truly the answer, the disappearance of the air coupe remains a relatively isolated case, just as the disappearance of Fred Valentek is quite isolated. Being in the province of civil aviation, the accident reports and summaries for both incidents were not restricted. The small and lightweight nature of both aircraft also suggests that UFOs cannot or do not bother with the larger aircraft, erasing them from being responsible for most of the most sensational and unbelievable appearances in the triangle, especially the airliners and those craft close to shore within reach of radar. No UFOs were seen in relation to the two remarkable disappearances of aircraft coming in for a landing at St. Thomas, though the interference of a USO is there in the disappearance of the Witchcraft at Miami's harbor mouth. Equally, it seems UFOs have visited or seen boats and ships and left them alone, although it seems they can interfere when they want, always in some way conveying their superiority, as in the Sanviti case. Of course, many planes have vanished so far from shore that their loss is more or less summed up by a Spartan, quote, aircraft damage and injury index presumed, end quote, rather than an investigative report. Any number of these may have fallen afoul one of these UFOs, and it is impossible that we could ever know. If UFOs are really interstellar spacecraft, and if their inhabitants are fairly intelligent, then they know to refrain from kidnapping close to shore where they can be observed doing so. Most disappearances in the triangle traditionally have been those far out to sea, where little can be guessed as to what happened. But it can equally be said that too much can be second-guessed for what goes on in the deep sea. Whatever can be definitely said of UFOs, it can be said that there seems the frank and apparent association between them and the oceans, and judging by the 2 disappearances on record in which a UFO was associated, they wait to strike only over the seas. Aside from frequency of travel, the triangle offers something else. The unique geography of the shallow banks and deep water gorges may be a prerequisite for, or they are even conducive to the needs of UFO inhabitants. Or it may be that in this world beneath, there is something they need. Proponents of the abduction theory have one other factor to support their ominous view. It is something outside the triangle, but directly in line with it. Aside from the shores of the triangle, UFOs are seen most frequently off Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. Again, it is at dusk, and again they flee back out into the Atlantic, heading south to the triangle. It is along these flight paths where the most eerie cases of disappearances outside the triangle occur. This includes deserted vessels. There is no room in this present work to detail these, but a recent one is rather curious. It is the case of the deserted El Actuel, and it's spelled L''Actuel, a large French sailing vessel with 2 experienced sailors aboard, regatta racer Gaiden de la Gouble. I'll just spell the last word of that, Goublay, and his friend Dennis Gilman. Last name spelled Guilmin. They had set sail from Newfoundland in May 2009 for Le Havre, France. However, on June 21st, the yacht was found deserted west of the Azores, far south of its course and where it could not have drifted. Presumably, the duo had turned south toward the Sargasso Sea, where they had then vanished from the El Actuel, and it continued to drift in the current. The sailboat was trailing lines. The mainsail was set but dangling, and the headsail was torn but partly furled. The satellite phone and survival gear had been left behind. De la Gouble had sent his last call on May 24th from about 1,000 miles to the northwest from where the vessel had been found, a location that confirms the vessel had headed south. All aspects which may be involved, or at least considered, are, in the eyes of this observer anyway, interesting to contemplate, for so we do here, but the probability of UFOs contributing significantly to the disappearances seems negligible unless some motive which can be fitted to the location is proposed, such as they are simply protecting their own home or bases here, and their acts against our own craft. I mean, little more than when we swat a fly or bee trying to get into our house. A shoe on the other foot approach to theorizing if we accept that the inhabitants of the UFOs are insectoid. It may be of little comfort for the isolated traveler, but if the reports of the UFOs over the millennia truly represent the same phenomena reported today, and that they are, in fact, extraterrestrial in origin, complete with inhabitants, mankind has, in these millennia, spread over the globe, and though we may have been displacing them in the process in the last 100 years of our air and space age accomplishments, mankind has never seriously been interfered with. Nevertheless, reports of their existence in the triangle and their coming and going from the oceans draw our attention to this world beneath. The bottom of the triangle is the most unique in the world. Some of the most exotic geologic formations exist there, more intriguing than the, quote, domes on the moon, end quote, or the, quote, face on Mars, end quote. Surprisingly, many man-made features are being uncovered as well, some at impossible depths, intricate designs and configurations that indicate at some very ancient time intelligence was at work in the area on land and, unbelievably, perhaps even on the bottom of the sea, long before the dawn of our own civilization, when our own Greek and Roman ancestors lived in mud huts like barbarians. I'm not so sure about that one. But that's the end of the chapter here. So we have completed chapter 8. So next week, Thursday's show, will be covering chapter 9, Beyond Forgotten Tides. And we're really close to finishing the book now. We got a few more weeks left of shows before we complete this. Oh, we're going to have a lot of insert imagery here for this chapter. That'll be fun to put together. And next week's show should be within 2 hours. Shouldn't go longer than that. Just to give you an idea, this is where we're at now. We're very close to that. But I do have more material for us to cover in this deep dive series. It's taking a lot of time. We've been doing this for a year now. People have they have dedicated their entire lives to studying this stuff. So, and some of the people that experienced these encounters, it never left them. It's not like it happened to them and then they forgot about it, right? But anyways, keep an eye out. The members of the channel will be doing another Great Lakes Triangle show soon. That show is going to be public in the near future. Definitely by the summertime, I'll start releasing the episodes for everyone to watch. But I'm working on just trying to get a different show format going for the different topics. And after today's chapter, it does seem like I will have to do a separate show on UFOs and USOs. I have a variety of books here that are recommended reading to cover that topic, and it'll be best to separate it from the Bermuda Triangle deep dive series here. But that'll do it for today. I really appreciate y'all being here. Please consider passing this along to your friends if you think they're interested in this sort of thing. This is a really niche topic, so we're just getting deeper and deeper into this. We're going all the way down as far as we can to the bottom and then past that too. All right? But a lot of material from Gian J, Quasar, This author has compiled a lot of work based off of these disappearances. There's an additional 3 books after this, which I do want to cover. So, 2 of them cover a ship and an air squadron that had very mysterious things happen in the Bermuda Triangle, and then of course Amelia Earhart. And I trust this author with his research, that he's gathered everything that's publicly available, and he's bringing his own speculation to all of this with that in mind. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Again, don't forget to hit the like button. I will see all of you on Sunday for Let's Talk About It. We will be running that show again at 11 a.m. Central Time. So until the next one, class dismissed.